a little bit about me. My background is I'm a chartered counselling psychologist. So I was counselling for 20 years and I closed my private practice in 2019, somehow preempting COVID, retrained in coaching and did an ICF accreditation qualification there. Um, and so really started up a whole new business in 2020. And I worked primarily with women in leadership, running online programs for a few years. And then in 2023, I was approached by Dr. Lola Gershfeld from the States. She had heard me speaking on a podcast and then a LinkedIn Live session. And so she told me about EMC, about her approach. And I was slow to jump into it because there's, I do love learning, but the danger is that, we could do a course and then forget about it. And I didn't want that to happen. But what I found is that as the more I got to know and understand about this approach, it's like it was a really good fit with my experience, with my interests, and with what I was coming across in the workplace in my work with leaders and the need that's out there. So I'll tell you more about that today. So that's a little bit about my background. And I suppose I am the first certified trainer in EMC in Europe. But keen not to be the only one. So I'll tell you a little bit about that later. I'm going to be running Europe's first training in January. So what is EMC? What am I talking about? Well, EMC is short for emotional connection. And so it's a newly evolving and very structured approach to work relationships. It's based on attachment theory and the science of emotional connection, which I'll explain. And the idea is to get team members back to positive communication. So really it's, I suppose it's about recognizing that that disconnections and conflict happen in the workplace all the time. And so this focuses on the emotional message that team members send to each other. Some other approaches often focus on what's said or how we can come to some kind of agreement. But this is really about the emotional kind of messages that are sent and how we impact others and how we can become more aware of that. And when that there is when something happens in the relationship, that we know how to resolve that rather than it just growing distrust and miscommunication and becoming full-blown conflict. So it's really about the bond there. So this approach is very practical in giving people the tools to build and repair workplace relationships, even after conflict. But there doesn't have to be full-blown conflict because our interpretation or of that word can be quite different. And often I think people think of conflict as being almost like fisticuffs or something kind of full blown. And actually, sorry, now it's still admitting people. Yeah, that's it can be very implicit, it can be very underground, and people might not even think of something as conflict, but just maybe a rift, a rupture in a relationship. So that might be preferable language for you. So you're very welcome to those of you who have just joined. Thank you. I see the numbers coming up all the time. So if you wouldn't mind popping your full name into the chat and letting us know where you're calling in from as well, that would be lovely. And if anybody has questions as I'm going along, pop them into chat and I'll take time every now and again to look at the chat and make sure that I am answering your questions. And we'll also leave time at the end too. So as I said, EMC stands for emotional connection. And so the strategy is really centered about the systematic exploration of emotions which are present, those difficult emotions present when we're under stress, when there's a lot of uncertainty and volatility, which is happening in our workplace all the time now, thanks to, how fast things are moving since COVID and the political instability and economic instability and the constant change that is happening in workplaces, which can put people under a lot of stress, which means that then relationships are often under duress. And so, when these difficult emotions are understood and addressed, then participants can begin to work to create and to recreate really emotional safety. We know the importance of psychological safety in the workplace. There's a lot of research around that. But very often, people don't know, or managers don't know. Well, how do you establish that, or what's involved in that, or these two are fighting all the time? What do I do about that? Um, I'm literally just off a coaching session with a manager, um, and time and time again, this is what people present in coaching sessions with me is, how do I deal with this person? Even even when I hear their name, it gets a reaction out of me, or they're fighting and I have to try and manage that, or this is grievance procedures happening. There's so much happening in the workplace, and it's very difficult for people. And so I think it's really important that I want to share this approach because I just see it as being so needed. So it's really, about healing those workplace relationships, giving people the skills to repair things when things go wrong, as inevitably they will, so that stronger bonds can form. And then when those stronger bonds are in place and people feel safe, they can bring their authentic selves to work. They can work more to their potential. So EMC is developed and researched by a US psychologist who's based in California, Dr. Lola Gershfeld and her team. 15 years of research. She has several books authored on the subject and lots of case studies. So the website, emcleaders.com, you can see the logo there. That website has a huge amount of resources. So I'd really encourage you to go and look that up. And then if you'd like to find out more, come to me as the base here in Europe and Ireland in particular. So I'm going to go through a little bit about the theoretical foundations first to give you an understanding of where this comes from and what it's based on. It's not pulled out of thin air. So it's very strongly based on attachment theory, and it's taken me a while to kind of look through the attachment lens. So Bowlby was like the founding father of attachment theory, really, and he believes that our earliest bonds, formed by an infant, really, when they come into the world with their primary caregiver, and attachment theory was first kind of put forward in the 1950s and 60s. So the primary caregiver was primarily the mum. But those earliest bonds with our caregivers, they have a lasting impact on how we form relationships through our lives. So we learn things about the world, or we infer things about the world through whatever our experience is with those primary caregivers at the very start. So if we're left long periods of time to cry, or if we're responded to kind of unpredictably or erratically, then we might learn to distrust the world, and we might have an insecure attachment. Whereas if we learn that our needs will be met and that our cries will be responded to and we're held and our nappy is changed and so on, then we learn a greater trust and we have more security. What's interesting about EMC, though, is that we don't need to know about what attachment style you are. It's about, in the workplace, looking at what can we learn about attachment theory, and creating those creating the environment so that we can be secure in our relationships. And so Bowlby and others demonstrated that nurturance and responsiveness are the key determinants of attachment. And that's really important because they're the qualities then that leaders need to portray in their interactions with their direct reports, in order to create that safety and security for people. So a little bit more on attachment, this time on adult bonding, some research where they focused on adult bonding, attachment, and leadership. And they found that when leaders lose connection with their direct reports, they end up in distressed cycles. And so when they provide repeated experience of safe haven and secure base, employees become more engaged, more open, and more responsive to each other. So it creates a very different kind of culture and environment when you have that type of leader who can create that safety and that space. And that's what we want to create, because we know, and we'll go through some stats here as well today about there's very high disengagement across globally in workplaces. Okay. So when we look at and applying attachment theory in the workplace, essentially what's important to know is that we are social creatures. We cannot thrive in isolation. If we go back over the centuries, we're born into a tribe, really, and our survival depended on that tribe. And if somebody was excluded from the tribe or rejected from the tribe, it meant certain death. And so, we've inherited a lot of that. We absolutely depend on those social connections for our survival and to our ability to thrive. So the biggest resource for human beings is that emotional connection with other people, especially when we depend on those people. So we depend on our managers and we depend on our close colleagues in the workplace. And so they are emotional connections. Now, that in itself is really important, because when I'm working with people, they very often, there's two key things that people don't realize in the workplace. First of all, they don't realize that their emotional ties that they have with their manager or their direct reports or their close colleagues, they don't see those people as being important. And yet they'll be reporting to me that they're losing sleep when there's something going on in one of those relationships. So we often don't recognize that they are, in fact, emotional relationships in the workplace. We don't think of them in that way. We have never used that language in relation to work before. And the second thing is that we rarely seem to recognize the impact that we have on others in the workplace, and the impact reciprocally that others have on us. So we talk about, keeping things professional, and it's a professional relationship, but yes, emotions are still involved. So if you feel secure and you trust the people that you work with, then you're going to be able to be fully yourself at work and work to your potential. Whereas, if there's a miscommunication, if there's a mistrust, if you like somebody or dislike somebody, they're all emotions. And that either allows us to do the job or has an impact on our performance and productivity. So when we can't find that safe way of connecting, then we end up moving into negative patterns. And that takes us further away from where we want to be, because we want to be able to collaborate and communicate and work well together. And when that's not happening for us, that creates stress and distress. And so when we can connect, or we can reconnect, even after something like that happening, then we feel safer again, and we can become much more effective at our work and become stronger as a team as well. So I'm just going to describe this negative cycle. So EMC, let me show you. I mentioned that it's a very structured process. This is the practice journal. So part of it is we take people through what's called a reconnection process. It's one of the tools, and it's made up of many tools, where we recognize the negative cycle that is happening between two people whenever there's a disconnect. So if I go in and I have a question for my manager or my boss, for example, and they use a certain tone of voice, or their facial expression, isn't favorable, then something in me is likely to be triggered, and I'll have my reaction, and then my reaction is likely to trigger them, and we get into what's this negative cycle. And so the reconnection process is about, you can't see there, but it's like a checklist. So there's no dangerous, how are you feeling? Let's pick some fluffy emotions out of the air. That is just unsafe for most people in the workplace. This is very safe and structured, and I think the structure creates a lot of the safety in my experience. You're helping people to recognize down a checklist what their emotions are. There's no pinpointing, identifying you're to blame, or he said that, she said this, and she just needs to change her attitude or whatever. It's about recognizing there's something going on between the two of us. I think we're stuck in a negative cycle. So the negative cycle happens at the space between us, and that's what's to blame. So I'm not blaming you, and you're not blaming me. Okay. So that makes it a lot safer too. So as you can see in the negative cycle here, there's the first step is somebody is triggered. It could be that look that my boss gives me when I come into the room, and that triggers some kind of response in me. I might not even be conscious that I'm feeling triggered. Most of the time, we're not. Um, but it hits off something in me. It touches some of maybe my raw spots. And we have a list of raw spots to help that are typical in the workplace to help people recognize what's happening for them. And then I may have a surface reaction. So I might feel irritated or frustrated or annoyed or shut down or any of those kind of things. Again, a whole list of emotions. But our surface emotions are the ones that we see on the surface and usually the ones we become more aware of, even if we don't have good language around them. And surface emotions tend to push other people away. While all of that is happening, and of course, we know with emotions that happen in an instant, there's an automatic thought like it might be, she's not listening, or she doesn't even want to see me, or she doesn't care, for example, or I got to get out of here. So we have automatic thoughts, and we then have, with all that's happening, we step into protective behavior. So I might make an excuse and leave and withdraw, or I might confront and go, you're not listening. I've been trying to catch you. This is really important. Can we talk about this? So we have different protective behaviors, which then trigger often the other person. And they're going around in their cycle, and we're re-triggering each other and going around in that cycle. And you've all experienced this, not just in work, but at home, in your personal relationships, even with the person that you love most in the world. We still get triggered every now and again. We still, have a disconnect where maybe their tone of voice was sarcastic and you're kind of left looking, going, what, why, or why are you getting angry, or what's going on? And then we're kind of super sensitive to them for a while and maybe hurt more easily. So this negative cycle, even the process of recognizing the different steps in the negative cycle, are building self-awareness as we go. They're the process that I showed you just is structured in a specific way to de-escalate the difficult emotions. So we know that these negative cycles have a negative impact on work team interactions. There's a whole lot of different things that start happening. There's, poor communication, lack of collaboration. It can be then lack of motivation, lack of empathy, because I'm caught up in my stress and how annoyed I am at you. So then I'm not feeling empathic or compassionate towards you. Might have tunnel vision. There's often workplace conflicts start to erupt. I might not have the skills to directly address this with you, but I might be talking about it to my colleague over here. And that creates a more toxic environment. We're also likely to disengage. So there can be, some people will have more aggressive behavior, others will withdraw. So let me just explain that very briefly. If we go back and look at the negative cycle, you can see number 5 there is protective behaviors, okay? So typically, very often you'll have one person who's a withdrawer and the other person who's a pursuer. Both of these can be understood as these positions can be understood as each person in their own way trying to protect the relationship. So there's a positive intent behind it. They're trying to protect the relationship. I might withdraw because I want to shut this down. I don't want it to escalate. I don't want it to blow up. And so I'm going to keep my distance and maybe avoid you because I don't want to have a fight, because that's dangerous and this is, a professional environment. And so that's me. You might sense my withdrawing and go into pursuer mode. And the pursuer mode is often the person who's trying to fix it. So we need to talk. Why haven't you been answering my emails? What's going on? We need to sort this out. And in that may come across as blaming, as critical, or as judgmental. Um, and I think of it like Pac-Man. So you have the pursuer kind of like Pac-Man and the withdrawer running further away. So as the withdrawer senses somebody pursuing, they're more likely to get away out of there and shut down further. As the pursuer senses that person withdrawing, they give chase harder. And so you get this kind of pursuit. It doesn't always happen that way. If you have two pursuers and both people are, want to get in there and fix it. So actually that makes it a whole lot easier, even though they might appear to be escalating or clashing. If you have two withdrawers, both people are trying to get out of there, trying to shut it down. They could stonewall each other and not speak. And that's more difficult to get them to the table because they want to withdraw. That's their natural inclination. Get out of here, avoid conflict at all costs. But of course, the not speaking to each other is a form of conflict. So you might recognize you're probably more one than the other. There may be some relationships that you are, withdraw, and others that you're a pursuer, but you're probably more of one than another. And what tends to happen is that goes around in that negative cycle, a vicious cycle, really, and it has a big impact on us. This is where people are often, stressed, distressed. We have 1 in 4 people in the workplace on average who will miss work or avoid work due to conflict. So the stress of it has them out sick or has them avoiding because they don't want to face that person. So that's 1 in 4. So there's a very big impact when conflict is happening, even if people are avoiding having the conflict as such. It's there, it's present. There are difficult emotions, and there's a disconnect. So when we look at the neuroscience, if you take into account the importance of that kind of attachment, security, and safety in the workplace, when there's a disconnect, essentially at some level, we're feeling either rejected or abandoned, particularly with our boss if there's a difficult interaction. And that triggers all kinds of reactions within us. Again, unconscious. We're not aware that this is happening, but our brain is wired this way for our survival. We need to feel included, respected, valued, and appreciated. And so the neuroscience findings have shown that if we feel excluded or rejected or abandoned in some way, that has the same impact on our brain as a low-grade punch. Okay, so it sets off the same kind of reaction as if we were physically being threatened, even though, of course, we're not being threatened and we're not in physical danger, but our social involvement and our social connection is under threat. That's how we experience it. And so we go into what we call amygdala hijack. So essentially the emotional part of our brain is fired up. And when the amygdala is fired up like that, the prefrontal cortex, which is your logical, rational, reasoning, thinking self, has to take a back seat. So the amygdala can override the prefrontal cortex, but it can't go the other way around. So that's why when you're triggered or when you're, having an emotionally aroused reaction, as in, say, if you're very stressed, very anxious, very angry, any of those kind of high emotional arousal states, you can't reason with the person in that state. You have to help them to calm down first before then you can engage the prefrontal cortex, because the emotional brain is going to override the part that tries to talk sense. I hope that's making some sense to you. So we know from the neuroscience that these disconnects have a severe impact on us. They cause a lot of stress. They cause, we either want to shut down and run away from it, or talk about it and vent and give out, or we're preoccupied with it, maybe not losing, we might be losing sleep over it, maybe have knots in our stomach about it. Even when it's not like big conflict, if there's a sense that your boss doesn't get you, or that that you're not getting the respect that you feel, or somebody has a dislike for you, or one of your colleagues, if you kind of have a sense that they've something against you, we feel very threatened. Our security and is threatened in the workplace. And so, the stats will show us that 75% of the time when people leave a job, it's because of that difficult relationship, particularly when it's with their manager. So if we look at engagement, this is a pathway for building engagement. So employee engagement, there's about 33% of the global workforce who are engaged, which is really low. That means 67% are disengaged. And out of that, maybe about 16% are actively disengaged, probably looking for another job or not showing up. But you've got a lot of presenteeism, the not engaged 51%, who are there but not really engaging. And so there's a lot of potential being lost there. There's a lot of performance being lost. And there's a lot of potential difficult situations happening, which can blow up into full-blown conflict, but there's probably disconnects happening in those 67%. And if we look at the daily negative emotions experienced a lot during the previous day, stress, 49% of people are reporting, anger, 17%, sadness, 21%, a lot of sadness, and loneliness, 18%. So those figures are close to, 1 in 5 at any time has experienced these emotions in the previous day. And that they're very recent up-to-date figures. So I want to kind of look at, well, why is emotional connection key then for engagement, for our emotional intelligence, and for, of course, conflict resolution? Well, first of all, emotion itself is key to restructuring negative patterns of interactions. It's not just about sorting out the logical, of a disagreement, because we can agree to disagree, but we can still feel difficult about the other person. Or we might actually come to some agreement, but still not feel right with the other person. So the emotions have been left out up till now, and they actually need to be the target of change. We need to help people to experience more positive emotions in the workplace and in their relationships at work. They are key to engagement. And so really, this approach involves creating new corrective emotional experience and creating bonding moments to repair that connection, helping people to reconnect emotionally with each other in a safe way, and giving them the skills that so in future, when they're triggered, because it's going to happen, that they know how to respond to that without going into the cycle of blame and withdrawal. Okay. Somebody else is coming in. So the emotion focus approach is really about, using those emotions, focusing on them, and giving people skills around them to resolve and repair the relationship issue, whatever that might be. It's focused on adult bonding, so bringing attachment and emotional connection in. This is one of the theoretical approaches that EMC is built on. And it's called it's emotion focused therapy, which was developed by Les Green and a lot of the work of Sue Johnson. So Dr. Lola Gershfeld, who created EMC, became very interested in and learned a lot from Sue Johnson in particular and her work, and was looking at it and kind of going, this is exactly what we need in the workplace. So really what Lola did is adapted that approach, which was a therapeutic approach for couples and in couple relationships, adapted that approach to better suit the workplace. So it's not therapy, and you don't need therapists to carry this out, and you don't need months of training because you're not an EFT therapist. This is about making skills really practical in the workplace. So managers can learn this, anybody can learn this, and improve how they interact. And so Yeah, but it's coming from that emotion focused approach, which is also based on attachment and the emotional needs. I hope that makes sense. If we look then at emotional intelligence, so I would use, I've been trained in the EQI 2.0, which is the one of the emotional intelligence assessments that are out there, one of the most frequently used and recognized, both scientifically and within the workplace, worldwide. And this but I suppose, and there are others, but any of them are great assessments, very valid assessments, well validated scientifically. But when you get assessed, it's like, well, what next? There hasn't been a roadmap to grow emotional intelligence. So every coach is doing it differently. You know, people are often getting the assessment and then just kind of left with that information, like, well, where do you go from here? Um, so emotional connection, the EMC approach, I think really offers quite a structured way to support people in the growth of their emotional intelligence. You're helping people, even in that negative cycle, you're helping people to recognize the layers of emotions that they're experiencing, both on a surface level and the more vulnerable emotions, the softer emotions under the surface, which are often harder to recognize. You're giving people the language around that, and again, in a structured way. You're helping people to, you're guiding them to recognize how they were triggered, what their raw spots are, what their automatic responses are. So you're making the unconscious conscious. And you're doing that in your journal here on paper, essentially, so that again, you're kind of seeing it in black and white in front of you, and it's an easy to follow process. And again, that creates a lot of the safety. And you're doing it for both people within the disconnect. If both are present, you might work one and one, sometimes two, depending. Um, so you're growing a huge amount of awareness about what's happening in me, and this triggers that, and that moves on to the other, and my automatic responses, identifying the fears that happen in me, because again, they're usually not explicit. My needs, recognizing my needs, because when our needs are not met, we go into stress or distress, and recognizing all those parts of the negative cycle. And then you're empowering each person to reach for positive connection and create a safe environment for sharing those emotions and responding to the emotions effectively. And it can be, my experience of working with this process is that even if you only have one person, there's a huge shift. It's a very powerful process that people go through because their emotions are being de-escalated. They're being heard by another person. They're being acknowledged by another person. That's all very powerful in helping to de-escalate and help them feel seen and heard in the issue. And helping them to recognize what's going on for themselves. So they're gaining insight into their own process and becoming more self-aware. And that in turn creates a shift where they begin to feel compassion and empathy for what might be going on for the other person. So even when you've only one person, that shift can occur. When you have both people, it's even more powerful because they're hearing it from the other and they're hearing each other's vulnerabilities. And instead of just seeing what's happening on the surface, those surface emotions that we can get stuck on and that push people away, when people can share their vulnerable emotions safely, that pulls people together. It brings people closer. And then they can begin to connect on a very different level. Um, So over time, they're building that kind of self-management and social awareness, and then that relationship management piece where they can generate more positive cycles, then break the negative cycle and generate more positive cycles of engagement and lead bonding conversations. And anytime there's somebody's feeling triggered or there's a disconnect happening, we can go through the process. So you're teaching them those skills. So it's, you know, you cannot help but build your emotional intelligence by going through this process. And the more often you do it, the more aware you become, but also the less raw spots you have over time and the less likely you are to be triggered, because you're building that self-awareness and there's that reflection piece and you're learning and changing and adapting as you go. So even if you start off being triggered left, right, and center, the chances are that over time, then you're less likely to be triggered and reactive. So the goal of emotional connection is to empower managers and teams with tools to repair and nurture emotional safety. Because people are learning self-awareness, they're recognizing the signs of disconnection, they're recognizing that there's a negative cycle there and calling it out rather than blaming and talking about each other negatively. There's a safe roadmap then for repairing those injuries. That's nurturing the relationships. That's also fostering resilience. It fosters cohesion in a team. It gives people a common language and approach, and it means really that team, it's like we have this common understanding, so now we can just focus on the work, because there's not going to be all this interruptions of people getting triggered left, right, and center. So it develops really a culture of support for emotional balance and increases positive interactions and thriving and success. Because when we are feeling good and we're feeling safe in the workplace and we feel secure and connected to the people that are around us, then we can work to our potential. Then we can see important performance improving. So there's some of the, again, coming from Gallup 2024, so again, very recent figures. When employees feel connected, the organization directly benefits. There's a huge reduction in absenteeism. There's a reduction in turnover even for high turnover organizations, 21%. And for lower turnover organizations, there's a decrease of 51%. So even if your organization, if the nature of the job is that there's high turnover, there's still a reduction in that. There are more positive outcomes, so it has a knock-on effect. So I worked recently with a charity introducing this approach, and the bottom line is that by supporting your people and creating better cohesion and safety within teams, that has a knock-on effect on the customer or the client base. Because if you're in a good state, or you're supporting your people to be in a good state, then they go out to the world, to your customer base or your client base, and they have a ripple impact outwards. So that impacts on customer loyalty and engagement. There's more sales and productivity and profitability. And of course, this impacts on well-being. Because, and my background is, 20 years working in the well-being space. If you want to help people to thrive, they have to be happy in their jobs. And actually, that happiness in jobs comes down mainly to the relationships, and much less so. Like, people will stay in jobs that they're not even that particularly interested in, as long as they feel good in their relationships. They'll stay because of the people. And likewise, it could be a brilliant job with brilliant pay, but if you're not getting on with the people, you'll be gone. We know that from experience and from the stats. So the more secure your work relationships are, the better engagement is, the better team performance will be, and the better growth will be too. So in a nutshell, this approach helps companies master the art of relationships so that you can spend less time dealing with the people issues, which take up so much time and stress for managers in particular, and can just focus on the real work because you've got that positive interaction and cohesion there. So how does it work? I mentioned that one of the tools is reconnection sessions where there's a disconnect. So I can be brought in to do a reconnection session where there is a disconnect, but ideally, I would train all levels within an organization. So there's different levels of training for different. So for example, all employees would have 2 modules, which gives them an introduction and an understanding of the approach. Managers and leaders would train in the masterclass certification level. And then you might have 1 or 2 people, depending on the size of the organization, who would go to my level to train the trainer level, so that I'm taken out, that still that they can train new people, make sure people are staying with that, so that over time the culture of the organization is changing and becoming more positive and healthier, and that this is throughout. Very often in reality, what happens is that you're brought in for one team, and one team that might work with this, and over time it's recognized by other teams. What, something's different about that team. I want a bit of that. And so they become interested, and it spreads throughout the organization. And the training, like any training, is short enough. Some of the work is that ongoing piece of making sure that people are integrating this into their work, spotting the negative cycles rather than, and the practicalities as well is that there's a lot less work in performance management if this is implemented, if the relationships are being worked on and invested in. So I'm coming towards the end. I'm going to pop out then of the slides and answer any questions that you might have. So I'm sure people have some. So just some of the benefits really to go through. It's really at its heart, it's about resolving workplace conflict, ideally long before it gets to mediation or grievance procedures or, PIPs or any of that. Like I really, the idea would be that if people have these skills, that they nip things in the bud before they start growing legs and expanding. And if they already have grown legs and have expanded, the very same tools apply, and the process works because it's safely structured. Some of the benefits are that you create a psychologically safe environment, and of course that increases team effectiveness, it increases engagement, and everything that comes from that. It's a safe way as well of addressing anger or stonewalling behavior or passive aggressive behavior in the workplace, and that lack of trust that happens. There's lots of different communication styles happening, and as I mentioned, somebody whose natural kind of inclination is to withdraw when anything happens, they may be engaged in passive aggressive behavior, or the person who is the pursuer may be perceived as being aggressive without meaning to. The positive intent is there, but it can come across. So this is really, again, it gives people those tools, even upskilling their communication, because how many of us have ever been trained how to communicate with emotions? And even having been a therapist for 20 years, I still find that there's a lot that I learned with this process, and a lot that I find very useful that could have helped me in my years as a therapist. So it's a way to repair those relationships and increase the emotional connection, which means that you feel better at work, you feel more engaged, you feel more connected with the people around you. And that helps to build agile teams that can evolve and change then. And so they're more resilient then to the constant change and fluctuation and volatility that's happening. The relational strength is stronger, the bond is there. And, in lots of workplaces, people are looking at bringing in more of a coaching and collaborative, atmosphere and way of working and way of leadership. And this supports that because it gives people those tools. So I would see lots of application for this everywhere. I mean, my big goal is just really to share this with the world, because there's so much conflict in the world. That's the main thing, that's the main issue. When we look at countries, and it's like this all starts down to, well, what can I do as a person and in my relationships? And if everybody had these skills, we wouldn't have the problems to that extent. So healthy employee relationships, for if you're with a company or an organization, at the bottom line, it's about creating productive, profitable companies. Companies want to know, well, how is this going to hit me in the pocket? How is it going to affect our bottom line? So to learn more about EMC, this is probably the book to read, belonged to Dr. Lola Gershfeld. It's not very thick. One of my friends read it in a weekend. It takes me a little bit longer. Emotional connection, the EMC strategy. So that's available. All her products are available on Amazon. emcleaders.com is their website. There's very little really on my website. I haven't reinvented the wheel and replicated. It's all there in the American website. And then I'm the Irish and European contact and facilitator and trainer. So, I'm happy to jump on a Zoom call with anybody at any stage for absolutely no obligation. If you just want to explore it or discuss it or see how it might, apply in your workplace, or, if you have any questions about it, just reach out to me. Probably you're already connected to me on LinkedIn, or, fire me an email or whatever. We can just set up a call. I'm not a salesperson at all. I avoid those kind of sales calls. So I'm just very happy to have a conversation, and you won't be pushed into anything. I can promise you. So just to let you know about the first live EMC training. So first of all, I mentioned that if I was brought into a company, there would be those 3 different levels of possible training. The one that's recommended if you are a leader, a coach, a psychologist, a therapist, or somebody who wants to work with this, a manager, is the masterclass certification level, and it's a recognized professional certification. It's accredited by the International Coaching Federation. I'm currently applying for the Psychological Society of Ireland accreditation. If you belong to a professional body that you would be interested in getting points for doing this, let me know and I can apply to that professional body. In the US, there are lots of big professional bodies who give CE points or CPD points for this. A lot of the HOR company bodies over there recognize it. It's still early days in Ireland and Europe, so let me know if there's a particular one. So this masterclass training can be done quite cheaply online at any time. You can just go onto emcleaders.com and do it. I'm offering an in-person live training. A lot of people have said to me that they would prefer to learn live. There will be group interaction. You would get to practice. I think it means that you will be much more likely to actually use it and put it into practice. So there's 2 full days training in person in Dublin in January the 23rd and 24th, followed up by a half day online after that. And if people want to come together again, I can offer that. That's not a problem. So we can have ongoing if there's a demand. So yeah, that will give you your EMC Masterclass certification, so that you are trained in using the reconnection process and that you can use that when there are disconnects happening in your workplace. It takes, in my experience, it's taken maybe, depending on the disconnect or the conflict that you're dealing with, each session might take 75 to 90 minutes. You might sometimes work one-to-one with people and then bring them together. So you might bring somebody through the process, separately first of all, and then bring them together and bring them through the process. Sometimes if a lot of emotions come up in the interaction, you move back and bring them through your emotions list again. You're going back a step, you might go through, so it might take a little bit longer, or you might need another session. So generally the process, like if you're doing one-on-one, takes 75 or 90 minutes max, and that can create a powerful shift just even in a once-off. If you're working with a pair who are in conflict, it may take a few more sessions, but it's not long-term, and it's not therapy, and it's the same process. It's very powerful. So if you're already signed up to my monthly newsletter, then you will get word I am running another one of these free webinars in January on the 13th. I think it's a Monday. And of course, there's the training. So let me finish sharing the slides here and come out and ask you any questions that you might have. And if you're watching this afterwards on my YouTube channel, feel free to get in touch with me by email or by LinkedIn if you have any questions or I can be of help.